February 3, 1945. Somewhere deep beneath the streets of Berlin, the silence was not of peace, but of denial. Above ground, the city still functioned under a thin illusion of order. Trams ran sporadically, newspapers spoke of a coming miracle, and loudspeakers continued to pump out reports of secret weapons that would turn the tide of the war. But those who lived in the ruins knew better. They had seen the black smoke rising over Königsberg. They had heard the artillery rolling closer from the east, and they could feel it in the cold winter air. Something was breaking, not outside, inside. Inside the minds of those who once believed the Reich would last 1,000 years. At the heart of this belief was Berlin, a city not just of stone and steel, but of ideology. It was meant to be untouchable, a fortress wrapped in layers of flak towers, radar stations, and propaganda. Luftwaffe officers still gave briefings inside underground bunkers with maps that showed enemy units as far away as Hochebirgersee, the Elbe. But those maps were lying. Just like the speeches, just like the dream. In the Führer bunker, the illusion was thickest. Hitler still issued commands for divisions that no longer existed. Generals nodded in silence, aware that questioning orders was no longer military dissent, it was suicide. The phrase most often heard in those halls was, "Es wird eine Wendung geben." There will be a turning point. They clung to it like a child hugs a bedtime story during a thunderstorm. The reality outside those concrete walls no longer mattered. What mattered was the myth, and the myth said Berlin could not fall. But myths don't bleed, people do. Above ground, civilians who once cheered in parades now shuffled between bomb craters and collapsed facades. The Reich's once gleaming capital had become a patchwork of sandbags, fire brigades, and barely functioning infrastructure. Children played near anti-aircraft batteries, mothers washed clothes in melted snow, and still, the posters "Victory is near, the Führer leads us, the West will be crushed." But there was no more cheering, only the quiet exhaustion of a people told to believe, while everything they believed in was burning around them. In those final months, Germany's last hope was pinned not on the army, but on the sky. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had become a symbol of salvation. Sleek, fast, terrifying on paper, the miracle weapon. Goebbels made sure every paper mentioned it. A machine so advanced, it would sweep the skies clean of Allied bombers and turn the tide in days. What they didn't print was the fuel shortage, the lack of spare parts, the bombing of runways before the aircraft could even take off. And worst of all, the Luftwaffe no longer had enough trained pilots to use it. Many Me-262s sat idle, while men with barely 20 hours of flight time tried to master machines years ahead of their training. But still, the people believed, not out of loyalty, out of fear, out of necessity. Because if the Me-262 didn't work, if Berlin wasn't safe, then the last candle of the Reich was flickering, and no one was ready to face the dark. Then came the whispers, American bombers being seen deeper into the heart of Germany than ever before. Towns like Merseburg and Leipzig disappearing under daylight raids, rail lines vaporized in seconds, convoys scattered like dust. Rumors of a mission approaching Berlin itself, a daytime strike, with no fear, no mercy, no need to return under the cover of night. But surely not the capital, surely not yet. In the Reich Chancellery, officers reviewed reconnaissance photos that contradicted everything their briefings claimed. Massive bomber formations flying undisturbed, factories producing aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, and worst of all, American fighter escorts pushing deeper and deeper, thanks to new fuel tanks and coordinated refueling strategies. The skies were no longer contested. They were occupied. Berlin's flak towers, once the pride of German engineering, had become relics. Immense concrete structures capable of housing thousands and firing bursts of 128mm shells into the heavens. But now their crews were teenagers and old men, their guns rusty, their ammunition scarce. Their fire, once a wall of thunder, had become a desperate whisper. There was a time when Berlin's skyline struck fear into Allied pilots, when the very thought of entering that airspace meant flirting with death. But that time had passed. The enemy had adapted. They had evolved. And worst of all, they had stopped being afraid. What remained in Berlin was not strength, but inertia. A massive war machine that kept spinning, not because it worked, but because no one dared to stop it. The trains still tried to run, the papers still printed, the orders still came. But every man in uniform knew the truth. They were not defending a city. They were delaying a reckoning. And that reckoning had engines. Engines built in Detroit, Chicago, and Kansas. Engines mounted on aircraft with names like Thunderbolt and Flying Fortress. Not poetic, not beautiful, just efficient, just relentless. They were the sound of an empire with no myth to protect, only a mission to finish. And somewhere beneath the concrete of Berlin, a city built on obedience waited in silence, waiting for the myth to become memory, waiting for the thunder. Before you scroll away, share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice matters in helping this history live on. And if you're new here, join us, subscribe, and become part of the story. The morning sky over northern Germany was a sheet of pale gray, cold, still, but behind that stillness moved something colossal. At 8:15 a.m., the first radar stations in the Hamburg sector lit up with signals they couldn't quite process. Blips, dozens, then hundreds. The Luftwaffe operator paused, adjusted the frequency, and watched the screen fill with echoes. It wasn't a patrol. It wasn't a decoy. It was a wave. The kind of wave that didn't come to scout or threaten. It came to finish. This was not an ordinary bombing run. This was a hammer strike. Operation Clarion had paved the way, softening up Germany's communication lines and airfields. But February 3rd, 1945 was something else entirely. Over 900 B-17 flying fortresses took off in waves, escorted by over 700 long-range fighters. Together, they formed a sky machine so vast it darkened the morning light. Aircraft each carried a purpose, a target, a final message to the heart of the Third Reich. Berlin was no longer out of reach. Berlin was now the bullseye. From the ground, the first sign was sound, not one sound. A symphony of engines layered on top of each other like pressure building in the lungs of a storm. Shopkeepers stopped sweeping. Soldiers on leave looked up from their rations. Civilians with ration cards and vacant stares stepped out of queues and tilted their heads. At first, it was distant. Then it began to grow. Not in volume, in weight, in presence. A physical thing that seemed to press against the chest and settle behind the eyes. In one of Berlin's surviving flak towers, a young anti-aircraft gunner with less than 2 weeks of training loaded his first shell. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion. He had not slept. He had not eaten properly. His commanding officer, a man once assigned to field artillery in 1940, stood beside him in silence. No, orders were needed. Everyone knew what was coming. They just did not know how to stop it. And then the sky broke open. The first wave approached from the northwest, tight formations, altitude maintained with machine-like precision. Bomber groups with code names like the Bloody Hundredth and the Hell's Angels. Their fuselages were scarred from previous battles, their noses painted with women, eagles, and death. But these planes did not feel anger. They did not feel vengeance. They were instruments, forged in Detroit and flown by boys who had once sold newspapers or fixed bikes back in Indiana. They flew not for hate, but for a mission they did not choose. A mission they now embodied. Berlin's defenses responded. Anti-aircraft fire lanced upwards, carving lines of smoke into the cold sky. Some shells found metal, most didn't. The bombers kept coming. German fighters tried to intercept, but fuel shortages and crumbling infrastructure meant they arrived late, in scattered groups. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, the P-51 Mustangs escorting the bombers tore through them like scalpels. Precision and speed. The Luftwaffe was no longer a threat. It was a memory trying to remain relevant. At 9:12 a.m., the first bombs were released over central Berlin. The target list was surgical. The Reich Chancellery, Gestapo headquarters, railway junctions, communication hubs, the Ministry of the Interior, even the zoo bunker, known to house elite units and command posts, knew
Each
their group
corridor,
of bombers, their drop altitude, their second-by-second path through a city that had once been declared untouchable. The impact was immediate and biblical. Walls did not collapse. They vanished. Firestorms erupted along entire city blocks. Glass didn't shatter, it disintegrated. Office buildings, schools, and administrative centers were swallowed in plumes of smoke and dust so dense they turned day into dusk. Trams still running derailed in silence. Entire intersections caved in where bombs found the underground sewer systems. Yet among all this, it was not the destruction that stunned Berlin. It was the timing. This was a daylight raid. Precision bombs dropped in full visibility. No shadows, no cover of night. The American bombers had entered German airspace without fear, without secrecy, without apology. The sirens had barely finished howling before the streets were full of smoke. The defenses that once gave the city confidence had been pierced, not by brute force, but by overwhelming certainty. The certainty of a war machine that no longer considered Berlin special. In the radio room beneath the Reichstag, operators tried desperately to maintain contact with outposts. Static, partial transmissions, screams, then nothing. A young corporal tapped the mic repeatedly and whispered the same phrase over and over again. Still active, still active, still active. But the line was gone. The net had been cut. The silence wasn't just eerie, it was total. In the zoo tower, one of the largest flak structures in the city, the command crew watched from slitted observation posts as the city disappeared behind veils of smoke. These men had once trained under Göring. They had believed in the invincibility of German air defenses. Now they watched powerless, as building after building crumbled like sand sculptures. One of them muttered something no one responded to, not because they didn't hear, but because they understood. It was over. Meanwhile, on the ground, something strange began to happen. After the third wave passed, after the rumble of engines faded into the east, no one spoke. Not the civilians climbing out of shattered shelters, not the emergency workers picking through rubble, not the SS officers crawling through corridors trying to make contact with command. Berlin had been many things: arrogant, loud, defiant, but now it was quiet. A father held the hand of his son as they walked through what had been their neighborhood. There were no screams, tears, no, just an unspoken question hanging in the air. How did this happen? Not the bombs. Everyone expected those, but the ease, the efficiency, the calm with which the skies were turned into tools of judgment. This was no longer a fight. It was a sentence being carried out. And yet, even as the smoke lingered and the damage was assessed, the worst part for many Berliners was what they did not hear. There were no declarations from leadership, no voice from the Reich's inner circle to explain or comfort. The public radios were silent. The propaganda machine, once relentless, was missing. It was as if the city's lungs had forgotten how to breathe. That silence was not just fear, it was realization. The fortress had been breached, not from below, not by Soviet tanks, but from above, in broad daylight, with a precision and confidence that no longer cared for psychological warfare. The Americans had come not to warn, they had come to demonstrate. And Berlin, once the nerve center of a continent on fire, now lay stunned in the ashes of its own illusion. What do you think people felt walking through those ruins that day? Share your thoughts in the comments and let your voice echo through time. And if this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe. This is not just history, it is memory preserved through you. They called it the arsenal of democracy, but it did not look like an arsenal. It looked like a factory floor stretching beyond the horizon. It looked like thousands of men and women working shoulder to shoulder under fluorescent lights. It looked like conveyor belts and welding torches, and engines being lowered into open fuselages every 15 minutes. In America, war was not an act of desperation. It was a product, mass-produced, standardized, relentless. By early 1945, the United States was building warplanes faster than Germany could shoot them down. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, they rolled out one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Not days, minutes. And that was just one plant. From Seattle to Fort Worth, bomber wings were being shipped like crates of grain. Across the Atlantic, American engineers were not asking how to beat the Luftwaffe. They were asking how to fly farther, drop heavier, and return faster. The war in the sky had become a numbers game, and America was playing to win. That industrial storm arrived in Europe, not as a flood, but as a schedule. Every mission had a number. Every aircraft had a tail code, Every pilot had a phase rotation. Every target a window. It was mechanical, impersonal, efficient. For Germany, each bombing raid felt like a new disaster. For the United States Army Air Forces, it was just Thursday. But behind the steel and the statistics were stories. Young men who had never seen Europe until they flew over it at 20,000 feet. Gunners who counted time by how many bursts of flak passed before their next oxygen check. Navigators who marked their survival by inches on a map. They were not knights in Yahai's shining armor. They were cogs in a machine that never slept. And that machine was working perfectly. The reason Berlin could be struck in daylight was not just bravery. It was fuel, logistics, engineering. The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed as a light fighter, had become the sword that carved a path through German airspace. Equipped with drop tanks and powered by the Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. This single breakthrough changed everything. No longer were bombers left alone in hostile skies. Now, they had guardians. Fast, deadly, precise. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on the planet, had no answer. Pilots were running out, planes were running out, and every day the Allies flew deeper. The defense network stretched thinner. Fuel convoys were bombed before sunrise. Runways were cratered by lunchtime. Aircraft factories were turned to molten rubble by sunset. The air war was not about who flew better. It was about who could still fly. Inside the Reich, there were frantic attempts to adapt. Makeshift training programs turned teenagers into pilots in a matter of weeks. Entire squadrons were ordered to intercept Allied formations with obsolete aircraft and no radar support. Desperate plans were drawn to strap explosives to old fighters and send them on suicide runs into bomber formations. Some of these missions were carried out. Most never returned. The Luftwaffe had become a shadow, and shadows cannot cast fear. Meanwhile, back in the skies above Germany, something unprecedented was unfolding. For the first time, American commanders could afford to choose targets based not only on tactical need, but strategic humiliation. Berlin was no longer a military objective. It was a message. Every bomb that fell on its ministries was a sentence in a larger story. A story about what happens when you provoke an empire that knows how to build. And build. They did. Over 12,000 B-17s would be produced before the war ended. Nearly 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. Ammunition factories operated around the clock. Steel plants diverted entire rivers to cool molten metal. Farmers planted crops next to airplane hangars. School teachers volunteered for civil defense drills in the evening after teaching arithmetic. It was not a war effort. It was a civilization in motion. While Berliners huddled in basements, praying the sirens would stop, American supply ships docked in England carrying crates marked with new radar arrays, advanced oxygen systems, and replacement ball turrets. The bombs dropped over Berlin in February 1945 had been designed, tested, shipped, and loaded with such precision that every step could be measured by the hour. This was not war as poetry. This was war as mathematics. And yet, perhaps the most astonishing aspect of it all was the silence inside the machine. These young American crews did not boast. They did not cheer when targets vanished into clouds of fire. They followed orders. They listened to the voice of their commanding officers crackle through the headset. They watched the altimeter. They wrote letters home. Many never returned. Some were never found. But their mission was not revenge. It was momentum. The kind of momentum only possible when a nation no longer fights for survival, but for conclusion. The German commanders could see it. Their intelligence reports were no longer full of hopeful projections. They were inventories of what had been lost, what could not be replaced. One report described the American bombing force as an iron tide, not because it was loud, but because it never stopped. It came again and again, and when it passed, nothing grew in its wake. Berlin was supposed to be the exception, the untouchable capital, the symbol. But in the eyes of the American war machine, it was just another coordinate, just another target to erase before the ink on the surrender papers could dry. That was the power behind the bombers, not their weight or speed, but their indifference. They did not come to fight for the future of Europe. They came because they had been told to, and when they were done, they left behind not just craters, but a silence filled with inevitability. As we bring this moment in history into focus, take a second to reflect. Would you have believed it if you were there, watching the sky change color under a wave of engines? Share your thoughts below, and let others hear your voice in this conversation. If you're learning something new with each chapter, consider subscribing. We continue because memory deserves to be more than numbers in a book. When the final wave of bombers passed and the engines faded into a distant hum, what remained over Berlin was not fire. It was silence. A thick, suffocating silence that clung to the skin and made the air feel heavier. The type of silence that does not come after victory or surrender, but after revelation. Not a single part of the city was untouched. The targets had been strategic, but the damage was universal. From the government quarter to the tenements of Moabit, the only thing louder than the bombs had been the sudden and unnatural quiet that followed them. The damage was not abstract, it was human. At the Charité hospital complex, nurses pulled children from the rubble with their bare hands, their white coats turned gray from soot and dust. The main wing had taken a direct hit. Surgery rooms flooded, elevators trapped, patients on stretchers being wheeled down crumbling stairwells while the ceiling trembled under aftershocks. In the maternity ward, a doctor delivered a child by lantern light. The mother never saw the baby. She passed before the dawn came back. Further west, the Berlin Zoo had become a bizarre symbol of the city's chaos. During the attack, flaming debris struck the animal enclosures. Elephants roared in panic as their paddocks caught fire. Wolves escaped through holes in the fence and were later seen near Tiergarten, running through smoke like ghosts from an old myth. A zookeeper, refusing to leave his post, was killed while trying to free the last black bear from its cage. It was a war between steel and fur, between reason and instinct lost. Underground, tens of thousands of civilians had taken refuge in the subway system. Stations designed to move commuters were now makeshift hospitals, morgues, and waiting rooms for fate. Families huddled in tight rows, covering children's ears as the walls groaned. Some sang lullabies, others whispered the Lord's Prayer. But when the bombs hit close, prayers stopped, breath held, and the silence between impacts felt longer than time itself. In one of those tunnels, a woman in her 70s sat holding a photograph. It showed her husband in uniform, taken before the invasion of Poland. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from memory. She had survived the Great War. She had survived the Hunger Years. Now, she felt something unfamiliar. Not panic, not rage, resignation. The belief that this time there would be no rebuilding, no post-war spring, only ashes that would never settle. The psychological collapse was not limited to civilians. Even hardened SS officers and Wehrmacht veterans showed signs of fracture. Inside the remnants of the Interior Ministry, one communications officer removed his headset mid-transmission, stood up, and walked out without a word. No one stopped him. No one asked why. They understood. There were no more orders worth hearing. By mid-afternoon, the emergency services were overwhelmed. Firefighters had to choose which blocks to save. Water pressure collapsed. Communications between stations failed. One brigade spent 6 hours battling a blaze in the Schöneberg district, only to realize that the hydrants had run dry halfway through. Another team arrived at the ruins of a school, only to find that the roof had caved in 20 minutes earlier, burying over 100 students. The clock stopped meaning anything. Minutes felt like centuries, and all around them, the smell of scorched brick and chemical smoke turned the air into something foreign. The sirens had stopped, but no one moved. People emerged from shelters slowly, unsure if it was over. Some covered their ears anyway, flinching at imagined sounds. Others blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the broken horizon. Familiar buildings were gone, landmarks erased. It was as if parts of the city had never existed at all. In one neighborhood, an entire apartment complex had been flattened. A piano stood upright in the middle of the debris, its keys still intact. A little girl approached it, placed one hand on the wood, and walked away without playing a note. There was no music left. The public radio stations were silent. For the first time in years, no voices called for unity, no speeches, no broadcasts. no commands. The people of Berlin had been trained to listen, to obey. But now there was nothing to listen to. The loudspeakers mounted on poles across the city played only static. Some were knocked sideways, others dangled by wires, like broken marionettes. And so the city listened to itself, to the sound of shoes on shattered glass, to the distant moans of the injured, to the eerie calm that followed total destruction. Silence became contagious. Neighbors passed each other without words. Strangers offered bread without eye contact. Even children, too young to fully understand what had happened, remained quiet. They sensed what the adults knew, that something irreversible had occurred. This was no longer a question of defeat. This was a new dimension of loss, one where hope felt outdated, where survival itself began to feel like a burden. Historians would later say the mission was a success, that the bombing had crippled key communication networks, disrupted the Nazi command structure, and accelerated the collapse of German resistance. But no historian could measure what happened to the human soul of Berlin that day. Because what broke was not just stone or steel, it was spirit. And as the smoke began to thin, and the first stars returned to a blackened sky, Berlin did not weep. It did not scream. It sat. It watched. It waited. The silence now was not shock. It was surrender without ceremony. It was a city watching its own reflection in the ruins and seeing a stranger stare back. If this part of the story moved something in you, share it. Leave a comment and let others see how these echoes of the past still ripple forward. And if you feel history should never be forgotten, join us by subscribing. Every voice matters in preserving what was felt, not just what was recorded. In the dim corridors beneath Berlin, reality was dissolving faster than the concrete around it. The map rooms were still lit, the phones still buzzed, officers still scribbled messages, stamped documents, issued commands. But those commands were drifting into a void. There was no one left to receive them. The chain of command, once so rigid and absolute, was now a dead wire. Orders were being transmitted into silence. By the early hours of February 4th, the German High Command had effectively lost control of its own capital. Entire divisions listed on status reports no longer existed. Radio links to battalions in the surrounding areas had gone dark. Telegraph cables had been severed by bombing or collapsed under rubble. Command posts reduced to craters. In many cases, the officers giving orders had no idea if their units had been overrun, destroyed, or had simply disappeared into the chaos. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the situation bordered on absurd. Maps were updated with arrows representing movements of phantom troops. Red markers indicated threats from the east, blue ones for defense lines that no longer held. Generals stood over these charts, performing a theater of control in a room that no longer directed anything. Beneath their feet, the city was crumbling. Above them, the sky no longer belonged to the Reich, and yet the rituals continued. Telephones rang. Typists clacked out reports, destined for non-existent outposts. One officer drafted an order for an airstrike to defend the Tempelhof airport, unaware that the runway had been shredded into gravel hours earlier. Another attempted to redeploy tanks from a unit that had already surrendered 2 towns west. The bureaucracy of war did not collapse. It just stopped mattering. Meanwhile, in the Führerbunker, Hitler continued to believe in a counterattack that would never come. He read reports aloud that no longer matched reality. He pointed at the map, moved pieces, spoke of reinforcements. But the army he commanded existed only in name. Those who served him had stopped believing, but no one dared to break the illusion. Truth was no longer spoken, only maintained. Even Joseph Goebbels, the master of manipulation, sensed the shift. His diary from that night reveals a strange mix of denial and despair. He wrote that Berlin had suffered, but would recover, that the people were frightened, but resilient, that history would remember their strength. But between those lines was a man watching his entire world crack under the weight of its own invention. Propaganda had lost its power when the radios went silent. There was one report that Goebbels read 3 times. It described the city as unrecognizable, not because of the physical destruction, but because of the behavior of the people. No panic, no riots, just an eerie calm. Civilians standing in doorways looking at the sky. Soldiers walking without purpose. Entire blocks where no one spoke. The kind of silence that felt orchestrated, as if the entire city had entered mourning without a funeral. And that silence had consequences. Without clear leadership, local commanders began making decisions on their own. Some fled. Others fortified buildings that had no strategic value. A few, seeing the inevitability of collapse, tried to evacuate their men and civilians. But with roads bombed out, rail lines destroyed, and fuel nearly gone, movement was impossible. The city was a trap with no exits. Even the mighty flak-turm towers, once symbols of Berlin's defensive pride, had become islands surrounded by fire. The psychological weight of that moment was heavier than any bomb. For years, the people of Berlin had been told they were part of something unstoppable, that they were chosen, that their city was the heart of a new world. But now, there were no announcements, no speeches, no leader standing on a balcony. The voice that had once commanded millions had gone quiet. And when a regime built on sound falls silent, what remains is not rebellion. It is disbelief. In the absence of structure, people turned inward. Former soldiers wandered the streets in full uniform, unsure if they were still at war. Police officers abandoned their posts, some removing their insignias to avoid being mistaken for authority. Civilians who had once turned in neighbors now offered blankets to strangers. The walls that had divided the city spiritually were crumbling just as fast as the ones made of brick and stone. But there were still attempts to pretend. A column of Hitler youth was spotted marching near Hermannplatz, their armbands spotless, their chants hollow. They had no destination, no orders, only the memory of obedience. A photographer captured the image and later wrote that it felt like watching shadows pretend to be men. The boys marched through smoke and shattered glass, trying to believe that someone still cared they were marching. It was not just the infrastructure that had collapsed, it was the illusion of control. For so long, the Nazi regime had maintained power through a performance of omnipotence, posters, speeches, uniforms. Now, with the stage destroyed, the actors had no script, and the audience had left. Still, some within the regime refused to let go. Inside one underground communication center, an officer insisted that the radio was malfunctioning, not the network. He demanded his operators re-establish contact with the Ninth Army. One of them finally replied, voice trembling, that the Ninth Army had been wiped out. The officer stood in silence, stared at the wall, then walked into the hall and removed his rank insignia. No words were spoken. These moments, though small, captured the collapse better than any explosion. Because power does not disappear in a blaze. It withers, it fades, it lingers in the corners, clinging to uniforms and habits until even those are shed. Berlin was not seized in one night. It was abandoned, inch by inch, by those who once believed they controlled it. And through it all, the people kept waiting for something to happen. A speech, an announcement, a command to resist or surrender. But nothing came. The silence had become permanent. And the silence, they realized, was not absence. It was the answer. This part of the story stirred something in you. Take a moment to share your thoughts. Your reflections help keep this history alive. And if you value the untold truths that history still whispers, consider subscribing. There's more to remember than what is written in the pages. Sometimes, the silence says it best. In the final months of the war, there was one word that echoed in Nazi command circles more than any other. Hoffnungsträger, the bearer of hope. And for a brief moment in 1944, that hope had wings, sleek, angular, faster than anything the Allies had ever seen. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was not just a new aircraft. It was a symbol, a promise that Germany had not yet surrendered to time or to fate. And in the propaganda reels shown in crumbling theaters across the Reich, it screamed across the sky like a silver ghost. Untouchable, unstoppable. Or so they believed. The Me-262 was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter. In terms of pure technology, of anything it was in the Allied arsenal. Its twin Junkers Jumo 04 turbojet engines gave it speeds of over 500 miles per hour, making it nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest American piston fighters. In ideal conditions, it could strike before even being seen. Pilots who managed to master it spoke of an almost surreal sensation. like flying beyond gravity, like controlling thunder itself. But war does not exist in ideal conditions, and technology, no matter how advanced, is only as powerful as the system that supports it. Germany in early 1945 was not a system. It was a skeleton held together by illusion and desperation. The Me-262 had been plagued by issues long before it ever reached combat. Hitler himself had interfered with its development, insisting the plane be redesigned as a fighter bomber, delaying its deployment by months. Engineers had to make compromises. The engines, though revolutionary, had a lifespan of just 25 flight hours. Every flight risked catastrophic failure. The landing gear was fragile, the fuel systems unstable, and yet the plane was rushed into service because there was nothing else left to try. Pilots assigned to the 262 often had less than adequate training. Many had transitioned from older propeller aircraft and were completely unfamiliar with the demands of jet propulsion. Takeoff required longer runways. Acceleration lagged until the turbines caught up. Landings were treacherous. A single mistake and the aircraft would shatter on contact. Some never made it out of their first flight, not because of enemy action, but because the machine was too delicate for the battlefield it had been thrown into. And even if the jet reached the sky, its enemy was already waiting. By 1945, Allied air superiority was absolute. American and British fighters dominated every altitude. Escort groups flew with ruthless discipline. Radar coverage had been extended deep into German territory. Every time a Me-262 scrambled for takeoff, it risked being ambushed before even leaving the runway. Allied pilots learned to circle near known jet airfields, waiting for the telltale rumble of a Jumo engine, then diving in before the German pilot could reach combat speed. Some Me-262s were destroyed in hangars. Others were strafed during takeoff or landing. The Luftwaffe began constructing makeshift runways in forests, hiding aircraft beneath camouflaged nets. But it was never enough. The problem wasn't just visibility, it was time. There was no time left to innovate, no time to build a support network, no fuel, no spare parts, no continuity. It was like trying to relight a candle in a hurricane. But what the Me-262 truly revealed was not a tactical failure. It was a strategic one. Germany had poured its remaining resources into a marvel it could barely sustain. A machine that had no supply chain, no logistics network, no long-term viability. For every Me-262 that flew, the Reich lost hundreds of man-hours, precious fuel, and a pilot who might have served better flying something reliable. The jet was never a weapon of war. It was a monument to lost time. Compare this to the American approach. The P-51 Mustang, while technologically simpler, was refined through mass production, battlefield testing, and constant adaptation. It could be repaired in hours. It shared parts with other models. It ran on fuel delivered in massive convoys that crossed oceans untouched. The Mustang did not need to be a miracle. It only needed to fly. And it flew everywhere. The Me-262 was a lightning bolt in a dying storm. It made headlines. It stunned Allied pilots. But it did not stop the bombers. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Because every time a B-17 reached its target, the war crept closer to its conclusion. And every time a German jet took off alone, it was flying into a sky that no longer belonged to it. There are stories of Me-262 pilots who fought until their last breath. Men who, knowing their aircraft would not, took to the air anyway. Not for victory, not even for belief, but because flying was the only thing they had left. One pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Schall, managed over 140 missions in a Me-262 before being killed during a landing attempt. His final words were recorded by a ground crewman standing nearby. All he said was, "I cannot see the runway." And in those 6 words, the truth of Germany's air war was laid bare. Blind flight, no runway, no landing. The Me-262 became a symbol. A question historians still ask. What if it had come earlier? What if it had been supported properly? Could it have changed the outcome? But the answer, always, comes down to the same thing. No machine, no matter how advanced, can survive without a foundation beneath it. Innovation without infrastructure is just noise. Berlin had bet everything on a miracle in the sky. But by the time the miracle arrived, There was no one left to believe in it. And so, even as its turbines screamed and its silhouette darted across the clouds, the Me-262 became a monument to a dying dream, a glimpse of what could have been, flying over the ruins of what already was. If this chapter offered you a new perspective, share your thoughts in the comments. These details matter because history is made of more than victories. It is built from the cracks in the myth. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told with truth and weight, subscribe and walk with us through the echoes of what was once almost forgotten. The day after the bombing, Berlin woke not to sirens or speeches, but to a strange, weightless silence. It was the kind of silence that made your footsteps sound foreign, that made birdsong feel intrusive, a silence that didn't just fill the air, but crept into the cracks of every building, every street, and every thought. The people did not run. They did not gather in protest. They did not pray together in the ruins of churches now open to the sky. They simply existed, eyes fixed on what was no longer there. The bombs had fallen for hours, but it took only seconds for something deeper to break. The idea of Berlin as a fortress, as the heart of a rising empire, as the untouchable capital of a world reshaped. That illusion had vanished in columns of smoke. What remained was not resistance, not even fear. What remained was stillness. In the devastated courtyards, someone swept glass out of habit, though there were no windows left to preserve. A tram sat frozen in the middle of an intersection, its driver slumped forward, engine long dead. Across the city, chimneys puffed with the last reserves of coal, as families huddled in silence, trying to understand what came next. But nothing came. No orders, no broadcasts. The machinery of control had stopped humming. There was no joy in the Allied success, only confirmation. The kind of confirmation that comes not from victory, but from inevitability. That no matter how long the Reich had believed in its own story, the world had finally spoken back. Not with politics, not with promises, but with facts made of steel and flame. Berlin did not fall in that moment. It unraveled. No enemy had crossed its gates. No flags had been raised over its rooftops. And yet, everyone knew something final had occurred. The true collapse wasn't in bricks or bridges. It was in the eyes of those who had once looked skyward with pride. Now, they looked skyward with resignation. What the American bombers delivered was not just destruction. It was reality. A city built on spectacle and symbolism had been met with precision and math. No poetry, no drama, just payloads and flight paths. And when it was over, the most deafening sound was not the blast. It was what followed, the silence. It echoed through the abandoned offices of the Reich Chancellery, where papers still fluttered across broken tiles, through the train stations, where tickets no longer mattered, through the schoolhouses, where lessons were cancelled not by decree, but by dust and daylight filtering through shattered beams. It echoed in the minds of those who had believed that a final weapon would save them, that a message would arrive, that someone, somewhere, would still have a plan. But there were no more messages, no more blueprints, only the smell of ash and the long, slow breath of a city preparing to surrender without being told to. In those hours after the raid, something changed forever, not just in Berlin, but in the minds of every man and woman who survived it. They understood that their war had ended not with a bang, but with silence, not with parades of tanks, but with the absence of command. And that silence became memory. In time, the rubble would be cleared, streets would be rebuilt, new voices would rise. But that day would never be forgotten, because it was not the day Berlin was destroyed. It was the day Berlin understood. And in that understanding, the war was no longer about who fired last. It became about what could never return. For years, the Me-262 had been whispered about, the wonder weapon, the promise of reversal. But what good is speed without fuel, or precision without pilots? What good is a miracle if it arrives too late? And so, Berlin became the grave not just of ambition, but of delay, of believing too long in what could have been, and ignoring what already was. History often marks its pages with battles and treaties, but the real turning points are harder to define. They happen in moments no one writes down, in the quiet, in the aftermath, in the realization that nothing will be the same again. This was one of those moments. And so, as the dust settled and the city exhaled, the skies over Berlin became more than empty. They became sacred. A vast gray cathedral above a population too stunned to speak. Not defeated in combat, but in spirit. Not conquered, but undone. By the end of the war, few German pilots were left to tell the story. Fewer still would speak of it. But among those who did, one phrase appeared again and again in letters and interviews. They said, "The sky no longer belonged to us, and it never would again." If this story has moved you, if it has painted something in your mind that you didn't expect to feel, please take a moment to leave a comment. Your reflections give life to voices long silenced. And if you want more untold chapters brought to life with honesty and care, click subscribe. Another story waits just beyond the screen. And when the next video appears before you, let it not be a continuation, but a new echo. Because in the silence that follows history, it is our memory that must speak, and our voices that must carry it forward.